So let's roll in and get started. So we're going to talk today about saving money on AWS, and I am Michael Forrester, and I am a cloud container and Kubernetes DevOps advocate, trainer, consultant. I worked for a variety of organizations, uh, including WebAge Solutions. And so you can find my bio on LinkedIn. I would love to connect with you. But I've been in infrastructure for almost a little over 2 decades, actually. And I've been working in cloud since November of 2011. I remember that specifically because I remember how it went down. And so I have been in this space for a minute. And sometimes people ask me to come in and do audits of their environments, especially in year 2 and year 3, because they're missing tons of money. And any place that I've worked for that has used AWS, I can easily say that I have saved easily $1 million for every company that I've worked for over time. Now, of course, as they add more projects, time goes up, but at least in terms of wasted infrastructure, I've easily saved $1 million a year for several companies. So let's talk about where to look. Now, this is a subject, by the way, that could go on for weeks, and I'm not going to talk about any third-party tools because while there's great tools out there like Cloud Health and Cloud9 and others that I could recommend, they all come with an associated cost. And so this is kind of the do-it-yourself version of the webinar. What would you do if you had to look for yourself and you were responsible for costing? That's what we're looking for. So rolling forward, a few kind of logistics. Make sure you type, raise your hand or type in your question. I will typically interrupt what I'm saying to answer a question, especially if it's relevant for what I'm talking about. So feel free to just type a question anytime. Slides will be available and recordings will be available as well. So just want to make sure that's clear. You can always get a hold of me. I'll put my contact information at the end, but you can always get me a hold of me at michael.forrester@webagesolutions.com, and I'll put my full link out for everybody, just in case you want to ask me further questions or you have some questions or concern. I do love to talk to people. That's something that has happened later in my career, when originally I was just one of those engineers that didn't want to talk to anybody. So feel free to email me if you have any questions. Okay, we have a couple goals today. One, we are definitely here to talk about the dimensions of costs when it comes to some core services. Just some things for you to be aware of, just some things to think about. Most of us are using, infrastructure as a service inside of AWS. So that would be things like Ec2 and networking and storage. And we're going to talk about that. And then, of course, there's managed services as well. And some of them are semi-managed and some of them are fully managed, depending on your perspective. But things like Lambda, RDS, which is the relational database service, DynamoDB. So we're going to talk we're going to skim the dimensions of service a little bit, just to make sure that you're aware of how you're being charged. But more importantly, I'm going to show you how to figure out the dimensions of service and how to get, for lack of better grammar, how to get good estimates, right? And then we're going to talk service by service about some areas that I usually look out for hidden costs. So I'm going to give away kind of the tricks or areas that I look at when I'm like, okay, when I'm going to walk in, where do I usually go where I know I can find money pretty much right off the bat, so that you can use it and look at your own accounts and figure out, hey, what's going on? We're going to touch on the billing tools inside of AWS. Unfortunately, I don't have a full account that I can show for you, because a lot of, I can't grab, someone's $1 million account and show you what that looks like for a client. But I will show you in my own kind of demo account where you can look at certain tools and how to set some of that stuff up. I will also be very explicit and clear about at least 10 best practices that you want to look at if you're, struggling with billing and costs inside of AWS. And it's super important, especially the very last point, which I'm going to make very clearly, which has far-reaching implications across all of your entire teams. And then I will talk about, just briefly, the official release of the new financial management class that AWS has pending, just so you're aware of what's coming and if you want to dive into deeper detail. I am an Amazon authorized instructor. I hold multiple certifications in AWS. I'm not necessarily sharing this class because I'm going to make bukus of money out of it. I just want to make sure that you're aware that's coming in case you need to dive in deeper. And AWS will, over a 3-day period, will teach you how to find and understand cost and pricing inside the AWS model. So it's an interesting class for them to publish, especially at year, what is this, 14 for cloud? So yeah. All right. So let's dive right in. So let's talk about the exploring like the dimensions of cost. Let's talk about EC2. Now, EC2 pricing is interesting because obviously you pay for things like size, right? I mean, you pay for the size of instance that you choose, right? For example, you might choose one of the compute optimized instances, which means that memory is at a ratio of typically 2 to 1. You may pay for one of the general purpose instances, and they're all t-shirt sized, right? So you've got smalls and mediums and larges and whatnot, and so obviously you pay for that particular dimension of pricing, and then you pay for any hard drives that you attach to it, and that's actually a separate service. Now, what's interesting though is that when you by default choose the size of instance, you say I want 4 processors and 8 gigs of RAM, and you choose an instance, you actually are automatically choosing what they call like a pricing type, like like a licensing type almost. So for example, when you just slap a credit card on your account and you go in and you say, you know what, I want 50 T3 micros, which by the way are pretty tiny boxes, right? 2 processors, 1 gig of RAM. I think they cost about 11 cents an hour. By the way, if I quote pricing in this webinar, I want you to consider that all to be lies, because not only is my memory on those things not awesome, but unless you see a number on the screen, just assume that the pricing has changed. Typically it goes down, just so you're aware. But when you put a credit card on your account and you spin up an EC2 instance, you are automatically paying retail price for your virtual machines. Because remember, EC2, the Elastic Compute Cloud, is just a virtual machine service. That's all it is. You choose a flavor of Linux, you choose a flavor of Windows, you choose what t-shirt size you want. Do you want compute extra large? Do you want compute medium? Like whatever it is. So you choose a family type and a t-shirt size, and then you start it up, you choose your operating system, you go to town, right? But there's a couple of dimensions of cost there. One of them is the t-shirt size, one of them is the operating system, because obviously you pay a little bit more for Windows than you do for Linux. Why? Because there's a Microsoft tax, right? Especially since it's not Azure, right? Which, they can eat that cost. But the other thing that we automatically do is that when you slap a credit card in your account and you go and just spin up virtual machines and you don't get into a contract or a relationship or look at some other way of consuming virtual machines, you're instantly paying on-demand pricing. That's retail pricing. That means that that's the published public price that AWS is going to ask you to pay for that instance. And so if you get, a C5 of a certain type and it costs $2 an hour, that is your retail price and you are paying on-demand price. Now, just so we're clear, on-demand pricing is the second most expensive way to pay for virtual machines. And a lot of people do that because there's pros and cons, right? Because we can't just get hooked up on the dollar value. What's the value of that? Well, there's operational offloading, but when you pay on demand for your virtual machines, you can also just give them back when you're done. And if it's a non-commercial version of Linux, right? If it's a non-licensed version of Linux, then you can actually get per second billing instead of per hour billing. But if it's a Windows host or a licensed version of Linux, and I actually realized that second sentence is a little misleading, but if it's like RHEL, which is Red Hat Enterprise Linux, or if it's OpenSUSE Enterprise, right? If it's a licensed version of Linux and a licensed version of Windows, which is pretty much all of Windows, you can't do per second billing, which is, by the way, defaults to 60 seconds. You have to pay per hour. So if you start that machine for 2 minutes and then shut it down, you're going to pay for 60 minutes. So also know that your operating system choice has a huge impact on what you actually end up doing, like from a pricing standpoint. But on demand is typically how we start machines. But here's the catcher. If you have licensing or security compliances and you want a dedicated piece of hardware that runs just your virtual machine and doesn't run anybody else's virtual machines on that piece of hardware, that's actually the most expensive version of EC2, which is dedicated hosts. Now, hopefully most of you aren't doing that because you're not having licensing compliances and hopefully not having any kind of like security shared tenancy issues. But if you are, then at least that option's open for you. And hopefully that's an edge case and not a core case for you, right? You're not working for some secret division of the NSA that doesn't allow shared tenancy. I don't know why you would be on AWS to begin with, but that's a whole separate discussion. But dedicated host is really the most expensive in terms of per virtual machine pricing that you can get. On demand second. And then what ends up happening is that reserved instances and spot instances, and there are links here, right? So you can actually see like the cost dimensions. But reserved instances is where you go to get a virtual machine and you know that you're going to run that virtual machine consistently 24/7, for a pretty sizable period of time, meaning 8 months or 27 months, right? And if you do that, then what you can do is you can go back to Amazon and say, you know what, Amazon, I really, and by the way, you don't have to talk to them. You can do this all through the web interface. You can say, look, I know that in Ohio, for at least 7 or 8 months, but actually it's going to be a year, I want to go ahead and I want you to give me a discount because I'm going to run this virtual machine for a year. I'm going to run this virtual machine for 3 years. And Amazon will give you steep discounts. I think if I remember correctly, the last percentage I saw was that it's up to 60% off of a 3-year. It may be actually higher, right? So if you do a 3-year commitment, if you kind of get in with Amazon and say, look, I'm going to pay for these 3 years. And by the way, you can pay for it all up front. You can pay half of it or a portion of it. You can pay none of it and still get a steep discount for the 1 or 3 year period that you've asked for. That's reserved instances. That's the third, probably like the second cheapest way or the third most expensive way that you can get out of 4 licensing types. Be aware that reserved instances not only have a 24/7 version, they also have a timed version, which means that you could say, well, my web servers only need to be up from 8 to 8, Monday through Friday, and I only need 10 of them then, and otherwise I can go down to 2. You can say, well, I want 8 of those to be on what they call a schedule reserved instance type, and you can just get a discount. That only lasts for a year, though, by the way, but you can do it for a period of time and say, look, I want to prepay for Monday through Friday, 8 to 8 for a year. That's the schedule reserved instance type. And that's, I consider that to be a sub of the reserve instance type, but you can't just ask for, hey, on the first of every month, I just want to run it for 3 days and then I'm done. So you can actually figure out calendar-based like discounts. Only a year is the limit with Amazon as well. So that's another version of reserved instances, is what they call scheduled reserve instances. The cheapest way to run virtual machines, other than, for example, not using commercial versions of Linux and not using Windows, right, which is just slightly cheaper per hour, is you can actually use what I like to call the eBay of AWS, EC2, pricing models, which is the spot instances. And what that is that it's interesting because let's say that Amazon has the capacity to run 1,000 of the T3 micros that I was referring to earlier. So they have the capacity for 1,000, and what ends up happening is, let's say that customers, either on demand or through reservations in a particular region, in particular availability zone in a region, are eating 900 of those T3 micros. And they've got 100 of extra capacity that no one's using, right? This is all speculation, by the way. This isn't really how it works, but just follow me on this model, right, for a second. So Amazon's got 100 extra capacity units for T3 micros and nobody's using them. So what Amazon will do is that if someone has come in instead of saying, because let's say the retail price for a T3 micro is, for ease, 10 cents an hour. And you come in and you say, you know what, Amazon, I will pay 3 cents an hour for that extra 100 units of T3 micros that you haven't been able to sell to anybody else. And nobody else is beating your bid. No one's come in and said, I'll pay 7 cents an hour. No one's come in and said, I'll pay 8 cents an hour, right? And you've put in 3 cents an hour. You win that bid and you'll get those T3 micros, and you'll be able to run those micros for as long as you can until Amazon either sells them or someone comes in and beats your bid. That's why I call it the eBay of pricing, because you can bid from the retail price down and say, Amazon, if you have extra capacity of this machine type in this specific location, I will pay you for it. But the only catch is that you'll be like, well, how come not everybody does that? Why doesn't everyone just do that? Is that your application has to suffer interruption. Because if someone beats your bid, or if Amazon all of a sudden loses that capacity, they'll give you a 2-minute warning and then they'll shut your operating system down. Now, people write applications all the time, like reporting applications that process and write and process and write and process and write, and they can support spot instances. But just know that this is the eBay of virtual machines. You basically take what the retail price is, the on-demand price, you bid below that. If you win the bid, you get the machine for as long as they have capacity or for as long as you're winning the bid. You can save up to 90% on costs, from my understanding, with spot instances. And I've used this with great effect, especially for reporting applications that don't need to finish until the first of the month, but I'm on the second of the previous month, and I've got time to get that done. Because by the way, if my report is due on the first of the next month and I'm on the second of the previous month, I can just use spot instances to get that done. And if I get to the last 5 days and it's still not done, then I'll just switch to on demand. But meanwhile, I've run my report, which probably required some compute power, at up to 90% discount. So you got to remember that is that on-demand instances is 100% of retail. Reserved instances can usually be somewhere between 20, 30, 40, it can be 10 basically to 60%. Sometimes it can get higher off of the retail price. And then spot instances can be up to 90%, right? It'd be 90% of the retail price. Now, the catch, by the way, with spot instances is that you don't know what people are bidding. So you've kind of like just got to pay the price that you're willing to pay for it, right? Especially over a particular period of time, right? So one thing that's interesting also is that as long as you're with your spot instances, as long as you're writing your data out to an external system like another database or DynamoDB or S3 or some other service, you're not going to lose your data. But if it's on the operating system and they give you a 2-minute warning and they're going to shut it down, if you leave the data on there, you probably lose it unless it's an EBS backed volume. So just something to keep in mind is that there's tons of guides about how to write applications to use Spot. So if you decide to do that, take the time. And if you want to talk to me directly to get access to those specific guides, you've got my email address. I'll be glad to answer questions for you. Okay, so those are the 4 pricing models. On demand, which is retail, the basically dedicated host, which is the most expensive way, and then you've got reservations, which is you getting into a contract/relationship with AWS. You don't have to sign anything, by the way. This isn't an enterprise agreement. You just have to do it through the web interface. And then spot instances, which is kind of the bidding version, if you will, of EC2 instances. So, and then of course, don't forget the per second billing. So again, if you use things like Amazon Linux or Ubuntu or other things that don't require an official license to run, then you can actually get down to per second billing instead of per hour billing. Just remember that you will pay for a minute. Most people take at least a minute to boot, so that's fine. But if you use a licensed Linux and or a Windows host that has, because they all have licenses, you can't get to per second billing. So just an FYI there. All right. Now, if you're running virtual machines, you most likely are going to be running attached virtual hard drives. And don't get me wrong, there is instant storage, which is ephemeral, and it's a whole different class of storage, but most of us are going to be running attached virtual hard drives either for our boot drive on our operating system for our virtual machine or to just hold data. So that's going to happen too, right? So that being the case, just know that you've got to be very aware of the type. So if you're using, for example, SSD-backed storage, which is IO1 or GP2, that's very different than using mechanical-based storage, which is colder storage. Just a word of note, caution here. The ST1 and SC1 storage types cannot be used as boot drives. So most of the time, in my estimation, most of us end up using GP2, which is kind of like general purpose SSD storage. So that's one dimension. And if you decide to use IO1, which is the really high-end provisioned SSD storage, you get to turn the dial on how many IOPS you want to attach to the volume. So if you want to add more IOs per second, which is like, reads and write chunks, right? You can just turn the dial on IO1. You can't do that for any of the other types of storage. So that's another dimension. Of course, volumes in terms of size is another big dimension that you want to be aware of. You will pay for the capacity that you've requested. All of these drives, by the way, cap out at 16 terabytes. So you want to make sure that you are aware that, you might put multiple 16 terabyte drives together, but you need to know that they cap at 16 terabytes. And by the way, as you add more space, typically IOPS go up, not necessarily for the mechanical systems, but for GP2 and IO1. And you don't pay for that, but you pay for it as just a natural progression of using a larger volume size. If you back up the volumes and take snapshots, which by the way goes to kind of like a hidden version, like hidden portion of S3 inside of your account, you will pay for that as well. Typically the snapshots are smaller because they're only going to snapshot or back up blocks that have data on them. If there's no data, they're not going to back it up. It's just going to be a compressed backup. And then there's this hidden aspect that most people aren't aware of and they don't think about when it comes to data going in and out of AWS. But AWS will allow you to stick data inside of AWS for free all day long. It's when you pull data out that what will happen is that there's a kind of a minimum network charge per gigabyte. And as you get into terabytes and petabytes of network transfer, you start to kind of like look at that bill. So the more you pull out of AWS, the more they're going to be charging you pennies on the gigabyte. So just something to keep aware of for all of the services. So you're going to see that data transfer section show up on all the services that we talk about. Another dimension of cost is, let's go back, is for like the simple storage service. So the simple storage service is super fascinating because it has evolved from the standard kind of S3 Glacier kind of tiers of storage. And now what's happening is you've got standard S3, you've got S3 infrequent access, you've got S3 infrequent access one zone, you've got Glacier, you've got S3 intelligent storage, which is a kind of a automated machine learning data classification engine that, like, not a data classification engine, it's an automated and machine learning system that basically identifies access patterns and moves your files to different types of storage depending on what's needed. They've got Glacier, and then they've got Glacier Deep Archive. So you've now got much more dimensions to S3 than you've ever seen before, at least 5, 6 if you include intelligent storage. So the storage class, which is what I just talked about, those storage classes are super important on cost. Glacier is typically 1/6 of the cost of standard S3, but infrequent access is also cheaper than standard S3. Infrequent access one zone is also slightly cheaper than S3. And of course, Deep Archive is cheaper still than even just standard Glacier. So you got to keep that in mind. Obviously, another dimension of cost is how much data you put out there. And then the number of requests, like the number of reads and writes basically that you're doing against your storage objects, those are huge impacts. So if you got a heavily hit object, that can actually drive up your costs, especially if you're on infrequent access. Glacier, by the way, is completely inaccessible unless you restore it. Glacier is meant for cold storage, but retrieval can cost you, especially if you expedite retrieval on a regular basis. And then, bottom line, data transfer. If you're pulling a lot of bandwidth across the wire out of S3, then you're going to pay for data transfer. So just something to keep in mind. So that covers, virtual machines, virtual hard drives, and then object storage, which is S3. And here we are, we're looking at serverless. We're looking at Lambda. Lambda, by the way, is an awesome product. It'll now run for 15 minutes. That's been true for a couple of years now, but just in case you didn't know that. Lambda basically functions as a service, right? But it can run more complex code as long as its execution time can either be chained or can limit itself to a 15-minute window. But Lambda's cool because you only pay for what you use. And Lambda allows you to up memory and CPU in this interesting relationship with each other. So if you need more CPU, you have to up the memory. At last blush, it was 1.5 gigs was the maximum memory size you could have. I mean, you can get really tiny with memory. I think 128 megs was the last one I saw. It might have been low as 64. And what this does is that you are charged based on the memory capacity that you've requested, as well as how long it takes your code to run up to the 15-minute max. And it does it at 100 millisecond intervals. So you get, by the way, a bunch of Lambda free just by having an account. It's called the free tier. When you sign up for an account, Amazon gives you a bunch of compute power and storage and transfer for free because they want you to be able to play with their stuff, which makes total sense, right? And then when someone invokes Lambda, it's 20 cents per 1 million requests, and then afterwards it stops. It gets really cheap. And then duration pricing also, you get 400,000 gigabit seconds per month free in terms of execution time, and then from there, it's like I can't even. What is that? 16th 100,000ths of a penny for every gigabyte per second, based on the memory size that you choose thereafter. So it's pretty good. So Lambda, but I'm going to show you, by the way, at the end game, an easier way to kind of figure out these costs, because I think this is interesting to know about. It might be hard to calculate without some kind of rule set, right? Relational database service, by the way, which is like your traditional OLTP. So that's Oracle, MySQL, MSSQL, MariaDB, Postgres, right? So there's 5 plus Aurora, which Aurora has Postgres and MySQL compatibility. In addition, Aurora has serverless databases. So for those of you who are running these databases 24/7, just a word of note, if you are not aware of Aurora serverless, you want to go ahead and take a look at that, because you might save a tremendous amount of money. Because one of the dimensions here for traditional RDS is that it will run just like an EC2 instance will run. It'll run what they call database instances. The databases, by the way, also have different engines. So MS SQL and Oracle have licensing costs, so there's a little bit more expensive, right? And then so it depends on the engine size, characteristics, and stuff like that. And then are you doing on demand for RDS? Because most people don't know, but you can actually get reservations for RDS. So you can actually get reserved databases that are cheaper than the retail price if you're willing to, get into that relationship with Amazon. Obviously, the number of instances makes a difference. The type of storage makes a difference. How much storage did you ask for? That makes a huge difference. The number of input and output requests in the database show up a lot, especially in the data transfer. And then if you do multi-AZ or read replicas, then obviously you're going to pay for all those engines as well, right? Now, does that get expensive? Getting hung up on the number is good to pay attention to, but also remember that you want to stay with the value question. If you don't have any DBAs who can do a primary secondary setup across multiple availability zones, and you don't have someone who can set up read replicas for you, being able to click through the interface and do that and know that it's production ready, that's an incredible value. But these are the various dimensions of pricing, right? I think most people get their minds get blown after a while, right? I wonder why that's duplicated. That's another little typo. DynamoDB, it is AWS's flagship NoSQL service. Awesome service. By the way, you can actually enforce strong consistency on this, so it starts looking a little bit more like an OLTP style database. But basically, this is an amazing NoSQL service. And what you do is you create a table and you put primary keys and sort keys on there with attributes that you can search against. The attributes, by the way, are all flexible, so you can add some attributes to one row versus another row. It doesn't matter. But the table itself has read capacity units and write capacity units. And so you can either set that to be on demand so that it will scale within a certain range you specify, or you can say, look, my table is going to get read 1,000 times per second, and it's going to be written to about 10 times per second, or whatever your number is. If you add local and global indexes, there are considerations there, both against the amount of storage capacity as well as the read and write units, depending on what you're using. So just be aware that there's certain dimensions around the storage size of the table and the number of read and write capacity units for the table. Cool thing about DynamoDB is that you can actually set, in a sense, multi-master tables that live globally, but those read and write capacity units are actually handled through what they call replicated read and write capacity units. They're usually referred as an RWCU versus a WCU. And you want to dig into that a little bit, because when you do multi-master, you got to provision that correctly, and that's a whole different dimension of charge. And then CloudFront, which is a content distribution network, especially for static instances, static data like images, but it can do RTMP like video and other video streaming. I actually ran an entire business off of CloudFront one time, which was awesome. It was the 4th largest video provider in the world at the time in 2013. Just so we're clear, the order of magnitude between us and let's say number 1, which was YouTube, was way different. But anyway, CloudFront was one of our aspects for our CDN. And CloudFront is interesting because it's about the amount of traffic that you expect to cache or copy out to CloudFront, and the number of requests that you expect against CloudFront, and data transfer in and out. Now, I will tell you that when you copy information from AWS to CloudFront from AWS infrastructure, they don't charge you for outbound copy to CloudFront, which is one of the few exceptions where they don't charge you for outbound pullouts. Like if you pull data out, right? They don't do that for CloudFront, so it's pretty nice. Okay, so I want to switch gears for just a second before I actually go through and tell you service by service where you can look for money. I just want to mention this really quick because I think this is very useful. Let's pull this up really quick. All right, so this, if you go to Google, for example, and you type in AWS Simple Monthly Calculator, it'll be the first thing that comes up next to the pricing calculator, which is another discussion I'm going to talk about in a second. This calculator, by the way, has been around for a long time, and the first thing they're going to tell you is they're going to warn you that this thing is getting retired, just so hey, it's getting retired. But by the way, they deferred it because of pandemic, so we're going to pause on that for a second. But this monthly calculator is awesome, and I have used this to figure out the cost for stuff all the time. On the left-hand side is a bunch of basically service items. And let's say that we were on S3, and I was like, you know what? I really want to know how much 1 terabyte of storage will cost me if I do, let's say if I like, like make changes, let's say 1,000 requests, and I got people on, it's going to be about 10 times that. So I got like 10,000 reads, right? So a 10-to-1 ratio. Not bad, not awesome, but not bad. Notice that automatically it's already updated the number to 2344. Let's say that instead of a terabyte, I was going to put a petabyte up there, which I've had petabytes of information up on AWS. That's tons of fun. Look at that, $24,500 a month, give or take, right? To host a petabyte of storage up there with these characteristics. Now, these characteristics may not make sense, but my point being is that you can come in here and figure out how much things are going to cost you just by answering these questions that are listed here. Let's say you're using EC2 and you want to basically add, well, let's say, I don't know if I want a T3 2x large. Let's say I wanted to use a T3 micro because, I'm just doing a little proof of concept, and I'm going to use ARM because I think that's a good option. So let's use T3A micro. Okay. And I've only got one of them, and I'm going to keep it on for 100%. Well, that's going to cost me $7 a month to run a 2x1 system on ARM with a Linux operating system. It's going to cost me $7 a month to run. So this can be great for determining the dimensions of pricing. This is the older calculator. The newer calculator is called calculator.aws, and this is actually an estimate tool. And so what you do is you come in here and you can say, you know what, I want to create an estimate. Let's say it was EC2 again, right? You say, I want to make an EC2 estimate. You just click on configure after searching for EC2. And then you come in here and you specify things like virtual CPUs, memory. This is a T3AX large, which is what they're using for the other sample as well. This is a 4 CPU, 16 gig system. How many of those do I want? Do I want to use any of the pricing options? And I didn't even talk about savings plans, which I think is interesting as well. But just know that you've got 1 and 3 year options. You've got no upfront, so you can actually choose which one of these you want to explore. Savings plans, by the way, are where you come in and say, hey, I want to do like a plan, a payment plan, basically over time. So just to make sure that I mention that. But you want to dive into that as well, or come to the class in order to really understand it. But you basically add your estimate, and at the bottom when you're done, you say, look, I want to add this to my estimate, and it will show up, right? This is what it's going to look like for the first 12 months. And then you can add other services, or you want to add support, or you can add other groupings to it. But this is the estimate tool, the calculator.aws inside of one of the new tools that AWS is working with. Okay. The other thing I wanted to mention is that EC2 can be an interesting little beast, and there's this website called Ec2 Instances Info that I highly recommend that people bookmark, because you don't really want to come hungry to your EC2 decision when you're trying to size things. Typically, the vendor will give you documentation. They'll say, look, you need 8 processors and 64 gigs of RAM. Well, how do you find that? How do you know? I mean, you could go through and scour it. The easiest way, though, is that since this open source project automatically scrapes the API for AWS, you can come in here and put 8 gigs of memory in, let's say, oh, sorry, I got that backwards. 64 gigs of memory and 8 virtual CPUs. And guess what? Now you've got a whole different set of options that you can look at to determine what you would choose if you needed a ratio of 8 CPUs to 64 gigs of RAM. And your sizes are listed right here. So we've got R5s, R5Ds, R5DNs, R5As. I will warn you, by the way, that in general, you want to pick the latest number. So R6s is probably what I would go for, because the latest generation provides the best value for the dollar, just FYI. These, by the way, are Graviton processors, Graviton 2. So this is a new offering from AWS. This is the 6th generation of the R series, 6th generation of the C series. I think the 6th generation of the general purpose is out as well. Notice that I guess pricing isn't necessarily being scraped properly yet, so you might have to go to Amazon's page to tell. But it's probably, in most cases, it's cheaper than what the previous generation R5 series is. but this will help you figure out what box you need. If, by the way, you were like, I don't need 64 gigs of RAM, I just need 32, you can simplify that as well. And then you just have to choose the family type once you know that what they are. Is it a general purpose family type? Is it the burstable type? Do I need is there a C series here that I can use? Now, that doesn't make any sense, right? My point being is that you can use ec2 instances.info to help you identify the machines that you need inside of AWS. So totally worth doing this. One of the questions that someone just asked is, what do we do after the simple monthly calculator is retired? This one right here. You just go to calculator.aws. And I'm going to forewarn you, I think there's some services missing off of calculator.aws, which is why they're taking some extra time to add some more stuff. So feel free, especially if you have an Amazon rep, to let them know, hey, you're retiring the calculator. We use, Device Farm all the time. There's no calculator here for Device Farm. So, but after the simple monthly calculator retires, they're going to be going to calculator.aws as the estimate tool. They got a lot of pushback on this, I think. So, and then because of pandemic, but also just timing. So this is going to be up for at least probably another like 3 to 6 months from my speculation. But calculator.aws is where you go to. Cool. Good question. All right. So let's dive in, because we've already spent like 35 minutes talking about the different dimensions of pricing. So brains are blown at this point in time. Let's talk about some other pieces here. So some questions to think about, and I'm not necessarily going to run through these in detail because you're going to have the slides so you can run through them yourself. But let's say you're talking about EC2 and EBS, which they go together like peanut butter and chocolate. If you run a virtual machine, you're going to have a hard drive attached to it, right? In 99% of cases. So one, are you using the right instance size or type? That link, by the way, takes you straight to ec2 instances.info, the site I was just showing you, that allowed you to choose your memory and CPU configuration. Are you using the right pricing model? Are you terminating volumes when you terminate machines? I can't tell you how many places I've walked into and I'm like, you know what? I can probably save you $5,000 right off the bat. I walk in and they've got all of these abandoned hard drives sitting in the EBS section of their console or account. And I just go in, find out which ones are detached, which ones have been detached for a year, which ones are not required for backups or data scientists, and then they're gone, right? So also other things to think about is that, do you need that high performant provisioned IOPS volume? Do you really need it? Like, look at the performance profile. If you're eating about 5,000 IOPS per second, then you can just run on GP2, right? You don't need a 20,000 IOPS volume, which I think they scale to 64,000 now if memory serves. It's like you don't need a 20,000, I'm sorry, a 32,000 IOPS volume if you're not using it. Are you auto scaling? If you're not auto scaling with your virtual machines, even if, by the way, if it's one, I've had Jenkins servers that I've set to an auto scaling group of one, and when they fail, they just get automatically brought back up. That's just good practice. But if you're not using auto scaling in production to scale up when you need to and scale down when you don't need it, you're losing money, I promise you. That's one thing I can say with 100% assurance. There's a lot of secret sauce inside of AWS. One of those secret sauces is that you have to be elastic and you have to create automation to be elastic. If you're not doing that, you're losing money, I promise. Are you shutting down your non-production environments? In a lot of places I work, it's the follow the sun model of development, especially for larger enterprises. So you can't really shut down non-production environments. But also a lot of those places have localized environments that are closer to the end users. So if I have people in Bangalore or Beijing, or versus being over in Germany or in North America, those environments can shut off when they're not being used. Now, of course, it depends. If it's a shared environment, it may not work. But just consider that, if you can spin environments up when they're needed and kill them when they're not, that's elasticity at its finest, and you want that for AWS. AWS wants that level of sophistication from you so that you can use them optimally. What about VPC? What about networking? Now, typically, by the way, VPCs don't cost you anything. VPC, like virtual private cloud and the subnets and all that, the internet gateways, they don't really cost you anything. Sometimes the NAT gateway and Bastion host will cost you something. But for the most part, what you mainly end up paying for is data transfer out, right? But also other things, like, are you pulling from S3 or pushing to S3 when you could actually just run a VPC or /gateway endpoint? What if you were connecting to something that you could actually pull into AWS and therefore avoid the data charge. Also remember that that VPN that you set up actually runs over the public internet. So as you push data across it, you're pulling data out, which means you're paying an outbound charge. So just something to keep in mind is that everything you pull out of AWS will cost you something. DynamoDB, good questions to ask are you using reservations? Are you allowing yourself to auto scale from a read and write capacity unit aspect? Are you using TTLs, which by the way you can do for tables, to drop data that will never again be accessed, especially if it's like a session data or leaderboard or that kind of thing? Are you rolling cold data to S3? Are you? And these last two questions I think are mistakes because they were under EC2, because you wouldn't necessarily shut down. I mean, obviously you would shut down non-production tables, but if you've made a table, you probably need it. When you're done with it, you just delete it, right? All right, and then S3. Really, the first question is really the only question. Everything else is a subset, really, of that. Are you using lifecycle policies? I was, at a company before lifecycle policies existed, and you had to manually roll data after a certain period of time to colder storage. You should be doing that by default. For us, we were running a video company, and the video files weren't relevant after 60 days. Guess what? They went into, well, they got deleted. That's what happened. Although there were certain accounts that we kept the videos for, but these videos were not important, right? We didn't have to keep them or archive them. Excuse me. My allergies are kicking in. One other thing though about S3 is that be careful if you turn on versioning. We had somebody turn on versioning on a bucket that had video files in it, and every time they went in to change the metadata, we got another copy of the video file. You imagine having 10 copies of a 1 gig video file because versioning has been turned on, and all that happened was someone changed the categorization of the metadata inside the file? That happens. Remember also that if you're copying data from one region in AWS to another, that VPC endpoints or gateway endpoints, they won't save you. When you pull data out of a region, you're pulling data out of a region, which means you're going to pay for it. Is it a lot? Not necessarily. So a couple other things where there might be hidden costs. So RDS, Elasticache, CloudFront, Redshift, I just can't tell you enough. Go ask your rep for reservations. Go talk to them. You can actually make the reservations in many cases yourself, but talk to your AWS rep. They will gladly help you save money on AWS. They want you to feel comfortable, not just spending money on AWS. That's not what remember, AWS is customer obsessed. They are very much winning and leading the cloud war. And I think that depends on your interpretation, but they've been running this space for so long because they are super obsessed with customers. So ask them for what you need, and if you're looking for discounts, they'll work with you to make that happen. One catch though, like for example with Elasticache, you do reserve nodes, so that's an interesting unit metric. One thing though about CloudFront, I once had a developer come to me and say, hey, I'm about to knock 20 kilobytes off of this JPEG. I was like, do you care? And I was like, no, sure, go ahead, make the change. It's minor. He ended up saving us $30,000 a month in CloudFront charges because that file was apparently downloaded a billion times. So whatever you're copying to CloudFront, make sure it's lean as possible. So if you're copying like static JPEGs and PDF files and whatever, and they're going to be replicated a billion times over, make sure they're as small as they possibly can be, because you won't know it. But 20 kilobytes of difference in this particular case saved us, what is that? I don't know, $360,000 a year. That was just one small change that the web developer made. Keep that in mind. Okay, let's talk about some billing tools. Raw. All right, so I'm going to skim these because we've only got about 12 minutes left, but I want you to definitely see them. So first and foremost, when you go into your account, what you want to do is you definitely want to like choose this little drop down, because I'm just logged in and I'm an IAM user, so not a root account user. Please don't log in with your root account. Even if you're just a single person on the account, please log in as an IAM user. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look it up or email me. I'll be glad to answer. And then you can go to your billing dashboard, and instantly it will take you to this place that has probably more information than you want, right? But the first thing it does is it takes you to the billing cost and management dashboard, right? And says, hey, this is what you're going to spend this month. And by the way, it's telling me zero because I have credits on my account because of my relationship with Amazon, right? So anyway, it tells me what I spent last month, which was like $12, because I bought a domain name and you have to pay for that. You can't do that off of credits. And they're like, holy cow, Michael, you're going to spend a whole $7, which is fascinating because I actually do some weird stuff with my account. So, and by the way, it'll actually show you your free tier usage, like stuff that you are you actually using what Amazon will give you for free. And so, but this takes you to kind of the base page as far as alerting and your spend and other pieces like that. What's interesting is that if you click on just this first one and go straight to Cost Explorer and then you launch Cost Explorer, you can get an interactive graph that actually allows you to dive into your costs. I mean, look at this. Whew. I mean, I almost spent $30 this month. I was doing some crazy demo where I spun up like 50 machines and then killed them. So here we are, it's like 2870, right? Where I'm over here messing around with EKS, the Elastic Kubernetes Service, and I was doing that. My costs have gone up 42%, right? It's intense. But the Cost Explorer allows you to have an interactive graph where you can like click around, look, you can explore costs, right? If you want to dive into different pieces, I can break it down by region. I can break it down by usage type. This is a fully interactive dashboard that allows you to dive into your costs. If you have not clicked into this in your account and you care about costs, you want to do that. So that's Cost Explorer. Let's see. The other thing is budgets, which is kind of like the second option down. So I'm actually moving over to budgets. I actually have budgets on my little demo account just in case I get close. And as you can see here, my overall budget actually did approach, because I usually set a threshold of 80%, did actually approach my forecasted limit. But I've got like containers has a budget. I've got DNS charges as a budget. I've got data stores as a budget. You can set budgets, and these budgets are all cost budgets. But you can also set budgets based on usage, which I don't have any of those because I'm more interested in costs. You can, if I had reservations in an account, which I have for some of the customers that I help manage, if people aren't using those reservations, I actually have a budget that sends me an alert if we don't make the budget, right? If the budget isn't met. And then if I have savings plans, which to date I don't have any customers who've done savings plans just yet, I would actually add that as well to make sure they're maximizing their savings plans as well, right? So something to keep in mind. So that's budgets. That's kind of the second area that allows you to set notification thresholds if you do or do not make a certain percentage of spend, right? That's important. Savings plans, by the way, is basically a way of offering lower prices on like a certain pricing model, like compute, for example, or Ec2, but you are in a commitment for a 1 or 3 year term. So it's a little different than reservations, which is tied to a particular service. Compute is like, for example, savings plans are tied to a specific class, like compute or storage or networking, something along those lines. And so, for example, like the compute savings plans automatically applies to say EKS and ECS Fargate, as well as Lambda, as well as EC2 usage, and you can spend it across your entire account. So savings plans are new and very interesting. So as we learn more about them, we'll talk to them, but they're going to show up also in the costing on AWS financial management class. So just be aware of that. Savings plans, cost categories, cost allocation tags. Like for example, cost and usage reports, basically, oops, where is that? Let's go back to that. Hold on, cost and usage reports. So cost and usage reports is interesting because this allows you to create reports that you can then run SQL and other kind of analytics against, and they dump them into an S3 bucket. So like, here's my demo report. So if we look at this report name, this has every single piece of content that I have in here, and I can actually, and it's in a Parquet format. So I can actually use Athena, which reads out of S3 buckets, or Redshift Spectrum, which also reads out to S3 buckets, and I can read this information, run queries against it, search for certain parameters, analyze it, and pull it into, say, Tableau for my dashboards and billing. So that was the cost and usage report. And there's also cost categories, like if you want to add cost categories and add tagging, and there's cost allocation tags, which is, by the way, you'll see that I have a bunch. Cost allocation tagging is one of the most important things you can do for your account. So just be aware that if you're not tagging your resources in AWS, you absolutely must. Okay, just from a time perspective, make sure that's all listed. Here's the other things, best practices for billing. This is probably the most important thing I could cover with you, is that one, make sure you understand pricing. and start as early as you can with cost optimization. Maximize the elasticity of your services. Use on demand, right? Use Fargate, use serverless, use auto scaling. If you're not, you're losing money. I promise you, you are not using AWS in a way that's going to maximize not only operational offload, but just your value, right? Do that. Make sure you're using the right pricing model, and then talk to AWS. If you're confused about this, AWS will help you with your account. Talk to them, especially if you have support or an enterprise agreement. You should definitely talk to them. Tag early and often, so make sure all your resources are tagged. Be ruthless about unneeded and untagged resources. Automate and auto scale everything you can. Be very clear about backups and retention. If you don't actually need it, please delete it or just pull it off site if you want to. And be elastic, be elastic, be elastic with your AWS usage. You have to figure out how to on-demand, auto scale, serverless, use that as much as possible. Okay, last piece, because you can read this yourself. You can, so there's a new class coming out in July called AWS Cloud Financial Management. It's like financial management at AWS. It'll have a fancy name, right? This is an intermediate level course. This is not for beginners. This is for people who are already familiar with the structure for at least a year of production workloads inside of AWS, who want to understand or are responsible for optimizing, managing, and predicting costs as you run workloads on AWS. This is a 3-day course. You're going to explore the cost of core services, much like you did here, but at a deeper dive. You're going to apply strategies. You're going to learn about the tools. You're going to play with the tools. It is recommended that you have at least architecting on AWS experience, like the associate's level experience. And then I've included in this every single component that is covered from day 1, day 2, day 3. So it goes through all of these different services and pieces at 10 times the deeper level than I just did with you. And then it'll talk in this like hands-on labs, and you're going to learn how to set up system manager and AWS organizations to help centralize governance. Sorry, not governments. But that's the new AWS Cloud Financial course that's coming out here in July. Now, I'll be completely remiss if I did not share this last little piece, is that, you know, I work for WebAid Solutions, and we teach amazing AWS classes. I'm not here to sell you on any particular class in particular, even the cloud management class. But if you found this valuable and you enjoyed it and you want to know more about AWS, just know that we're offering 20% off of all of the regular retail classes in July. You just need to use this discount code AWS20. You can go look at our courses. We have everything listed there. So thank you so much for attending. I appreciate you being here.